In 2373, the Borg returned to Earth. This time, Starfleet was waiting for them. Dozens of Federation starships converged on a single Borg cube as it carved its way through the fleet towards Sector 001. The battle was brutal. Starships were destroyed in mere seconds. Even the US's Defiant was crippled. Starfleet and the Federation had years to prepare for another Borg attack, but Starfleet was, once again, struggling to stop just one cube ship. Look closely at the fleet assembled around it, and you'll notice something important. These weren't the same starships that had faced the Borg and lost at Wolf 359. Starfleet had changed. Another word is saying they adapted. While the Galaxy-class represented an era where families could travel aboard these enormous vessels, new ships like the Defiant, Steamrunner, Sabre, and especially the Akira represented something very different. The Federation had spent the previous decade learning an uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes, Starfleet does need a warship, and few vessels demonstrate that change better than the Akira-class. Quick interruption before we continue. If you're a Star Trek fan and fancy adding something new to your collection, make sure to check out the Cargo Bay, our very own Star Trek collectibles store. We've got action figures, starships, pretty cool, collectibles, and loads more, with new cargo arriving all the time. And the best thing is, we're now shipping to both the United Kingdom, so the UK, and the USA, so get these while they're available. And plus, as a Trek Central viewer, you can use code TrekCentral at checkout to get 5% off of your order. Any questions, let me know down below. Every purchase helps support what we're doing here at Trek Central and helps us expand the cargo bay to offer more collectibles to people around the world. So make sure to use that link below and we'll see you over there. Alright, back to the video. At more than 460 meters long, the Akira combined the firepower of a heavy cruiser with something rarely seen aboard a Federation starship. Designer Alex Yeager envisioned the Akira as a combination of a gunship, battlecruiser, and aircraft carrier, and some descriptions of its original design give the vessel as many as 17 torpedo launchers. It fought the Borg, it fought the Dominion, and it survived into the 25th century. Its design proved so popular that years later, elements of it would help shape another rather famous Starfleet vessel, this being the Enterprise NX-01. But there's an interesting question surrounding this ship, because despite its reputation as one of Starfleet's famous so-called anti-Borg starships, was the Akira-class actually designed to fight the Borg? Or have nearly 3 decades of technical manuals, games, and fan discussions transformed a background ship from First Contact into something it was never intended to be? Today, we find out. This is the complete story of the Akira-class. For much of the 24th century, Starfleet's priorities were reflected in the vessels it constructed. Ships such as the Galaxy-class were extraordinary pieces of engineering. They were explorers, scientific research vessels, diplomatic platforms, and mobile communities capable of travelling enormous distances from Federation space. I mean, the Enterprise D carried families, but it had schools on board, had enormous recreation facilities, it even had dolphins as well, so yeah, because of course it did. The Galaxy-class could absolutely defend itself, but combat wasn't the sole purpose around which the entire vessel had been designed. Then the Federation's strategic situation began to change. Already at this point, the Cardassian border conflicts demonstrated that Federation colonies could come under attack by a sustained military threat. The reappearance of a Romulan Star Empire brought another major power back onto Starfleet's doorstep. And then came the Borg. The Battle of Wolf 359 was catastrophic. 39 Starfleet vessels were destroyed. Thousands of officers and civilians were killed in action, or assimilated. And the entire fleet had been annihilated by a single Borg cube. Starfleet had encountered powerful adversaries before, but the Borg presented something fundamentally different. And while it would be tempting to imagine Starfleet immediately responding by drawing up plans for hundreds of dedicated warships, we know the reality was considerably more complicated. The Defiant project, for example, was explicitly developed in response to the Borg threat, but the program initially ran into serious problems. The prototype was overpowered, outgunned, and extremely temperamental. Development was ultimately shelved before the Defiant itself would later be assigned to Deep Space Nine. The Defiant wasn't the only sign that Starfleet's approach to Starship design was slowly changing. By the 2370s, an entirely new generation of vessels had begun appearing. The Sovereign class, the Norway class, the Sabre class, Steamrunner, and then the Akira class. And this is where we need to make an important distinction. Calling every one of these vessels an anti-Borg ship is convenient. We've done it ourselves. but canon never actually tells you that the Akira-class was commissioned specifically as an anti-Borg warship. The original Eaglemoss technical material instead describes its development more broadly as a response to the increasingly dangerous environment facing Starfleet and the Federation, including both the Cardassian conflicts and the Borg threat. Exploration remained part of Starfleet's mission, but the Akira placed a much greater emphasis on patrol and combat operations. And then we look at the actual design of the ship. That philosophy becomes rather obvious. At first glance, the Akira-class is unmistakably Starfleet. There's a saucer, there are 2 warp nacelles, and there's a bridge sitting towards the centre of the ship. And yet almost everything about the traditional Starfleet arrangement has been shuffled around. More obviously, there is no conventional secondary hull. Instead, the Akira consists primarily of an enormous saucer section with 2 structures extending backwards from its upper surface. These create the vessel's distinctive catamaran configuration, eventually connecting with a transverse spar towards the rear of the ship. The warp nacelles are then suspended below these structures, while sitting above the centre of the vessel is arguably the Akira's most recognisable feature, its weapons pod. The result is an extremely wide, relatively shallow starship. According to the Eaglemoss specifications, the Akira measures approximately 464.43 meters long, 316.67 meters wide, and just 87.43 meters tall. That means we're dealing with a substantial vessel. At more than 460 meters, the Akira is considerably longer than an Intrepid-class starship, and its saucer occupies roughly the same sort of footprint as that of a much larger Sovereign-class Enterprise E. But viewed side-on, the Akira presents a surprisingly narrow target, and that appears to have been a deliberate design choice. The absence of the traditional secondary engineering hull reduced the ship's vertical profile, giving an enemy considerably less starship to actually shoot at. And this combat-conscious thinking continues elsewhere. Take the bridge. On many Starfleet vessels, the bridge sits prominently at the top of the saucer section. It is fantastic for giving us dramatic exterior shots, and it's perhaps less fantastic when that situation happens in that Alt Universe Enterprise episode. Sorry guys. The Akira takes a different approach. Its bridge is nestled between the raised catamaran structures, providing considerably more physical protection around the command centre. Extra shield generators were also positioned in this central region, while important transporter and communication sensor systems were similarly placed within the protected area. Even the ship's navigational deflector sits within the underside of the saucer rather than hanging from a conventional engineering hull. This gives the Akira a remarkably compact arrangement. But compact does not mean small. Star Trek production and technical sources have generally described a complement of approximately 500 personnel, making this a significantly crewed starship. And despite abandoning the traditional secondary hull, the Akira wasn't sacrificing much in terms of speed either. Technical material gives the class a maximum velocity of warp 9.8. So essentially, we've got a large, fast, heavily armed cruiser with an unusually protected command center, and a hull deliberately arranged to reduce its combat profile. Now already, this doesn't exactly sound like the ship Starfleet sends out to catalogue gaseous anomalies. Although knowing Starfleet, they probably will still do that. But we've still ignored perhaps the most interesting part of the entire design. Because designer Alex Yeager didn't simply envision the Akira as a simple battlecruiser. He imagined it as something Starfleet had almost never properly explored before, an aircraft carrier. Except instead of an aircraft carrier, we got a shuttle bay and potentially fighters. Think about what that means operationally. A conventional Starfleet shuttle bay has traffic moving in and out through essentially the same opening. You launch the shuttle, clear the bay, recover another, move it out of the way, repeat the process. The Akira could theoretically establish a continuous flow. And yes, if you're thinking about Battlestar Galactica, you're not wrong, that was the design inspiration. Now auxiliary craft can prepare inside the ship, they launch forwards, they conduct their mission, shoot somebody, crash on a planet, then rather than attempt to return through the same opening, they basically approach from behind. The rear recovery area is nestled between the Akira's 2 hull structures, and surrounded by the vessel itself. That gives returning shuttlecraft considerably more protection during what could otherwise be an extremely vulnerable stage of flight operations. And this wasn't something fans simply inferred from looking at the model. As I mentioned, this is exactly what Alex Yeager had in mind. He described wanting the Akira to be a carrier of sorts, with shuttles launching from the front before returning through the rear, because they'd be protected by the rest of the ship. That is an incredibly interesting mission profile for Starfleet, because suddenly the Akira doesn't just make sense as a ship that fights other capital ships. it can become a force multiplier. During a fleet engagement, an Akira could potentially deploy numerous small craft while the mothership itself remained in combat. During patrol operations, these craft could control an enormous area. The design is unquestionably tactical, but the carrier arrangement gives it applications far beyond simply destroying things. The Akira essentially can defend colonies, patrol disputed territory, deploy auxiliary craft, conduct rescue operations, and yes, basically everything. And if required, it could fire tons of torpedoes, so win-win. Of course, we do have to talk about the weapons pod, so let's do it. This is where the Akira gets slightly insane, and you'll see why. Let's talk about the part everybody remembers, the weapons. Because even by Starfleet standards, the Akira class was absolutely loaded. The most obvious feature is the large weapons pod positioned above the rear of the saucer. Visually, it immediately gives the ship a much more aggressive silhouette. According to the Eaglemoss technical profile, the pod contains 7 forward-facing torpedo launchers, arranged in 2 rows, 4 above and 3 below. The 2 central launchers in the upper row were described as being intended for quantum torpedoes, while the remaining tubes handled standard photon torpedoes. That was only the front. The same weapons pod carried 6 rear-facing launchers, with 3 positioned on either side. This gives the ship a substantial torpedo firing arc, both forward and aft. And we're still not done. Additional launchers were built directly into the saucer section. Technical material places torpedo launchers above and below the navigational deflector, plus 2 more on each side of the saucer, firing out port and starboard. Which leads us to one of the most famous Akira statistics. Designer Alex Yeager described the ship as having 17 torpedo launchers. No, that's not a typo there in my script, it's 17. And importantly, this wasn't an accidental fan estimate based on counting little glowing holes on the CGI model. The number came directly from a gentleman who described the Starship. The number came directly from a gentleman who designed the ship. Yeager explained that when creating the Akira, he was very much in a military mindset. The vessel only needed to appear during Earth's defense against the Borg, so he deliberately loaded the design with offensive and defensive weaponry. His arrangement included 12 launchers on the weapons pod, 1 beneath the deflector and 4 side firing launchers on the saucer. Now, you might have already noticed a problem with this, but it doesn't line up perfectly with every later technical description. The Eaglemoss profile, for example, describes 7 forward and 6 aft launchers in the weapons pod alone, before adding those positioned elsewhere on the ship. So how many launchers does the Akira actually have? Honestly, the safest answer is a lot. More seriously, the exact count is one of those areas where production intent and later technical documentation don't line up perfectly. The 17 launcher figure comes in Yeager's design conception. Later reference material describes slightly different arrangements. And crucially, Star Trek itself never gave us a bridge officer saying, "Captain, all 17 torpedo launchers are ready." And yes, that was my best Star Trek impression. Now I'd avoid treating any single number as basically the on-screen canon. Now what is absolutely clear is that the Akira class was designed around unusually heavy torpedo firepower. And when we see the ship in battle, the intention comes across pretty well. But yes, torpedoes weren't the ship's only weapon. The Akira also carried multiple phaser arrays. The technical profile describes 6 Type 10 phaser emitters, with the primary arrays running around substantial portions of both the dorsal and ventral saucer. That gave the Akira broad firing coverage against targets around the ship. And this combination makes sense tactically. Phasers give you sustained firepower, but torpedoes provide heavy impact. And with launchers facing forward, aft, and basically sideways, the Akira could theoretically engage multiple targets without constantly turning the entire ship. This matters enormously in a fleet engagement, especially against something like the Borg. Even the layout of the vessel supports that role. We've already mentioned the bridge being protected between the catamaran structures. The rear shuttle recovery area is similarly sheltered by the hull. Shield emitters were positioned around the launch area, and the weapons pod itself also housed tactical sensors. Interestingly, that pod wasn't necessarily useful only during combat. Eaglemoss notes that it could be adapted for more specialized scientific sensor equipment on exploration-oriented missions, and that detail is worth keeping in mind, because Starfleet rarely creates ships that can only do one thing. Even a vessel as heavily armed as the Akira could apparently be adapted towards scientific work when required. This makes the ship less like a pure battleship, and more like a heavily armed cruiser designed for much more dangerous versions of Starfleet exploration. So was it actually an anti-Borg ship? Now this is where the terminology gets interesting. The Akira's first appearance was fighting the Borg. Its designer explicitly created it in a military mindset for Earth's defense. And later technical material associates the class with threats including the Borg and Cardassian conflicts. So calling an anti-Borg ship isn't exactly unreasonable. But unlike the Defiant class, we don't have a canonical statement saying the Akira program itself was launched specifically to fight the Borg. That's an important distinction. As previously mentioned, the Defiant class had an explicit anti-Borg development history. The Akira has an extremely tactical design, which emerged during the same increasingly dangerous period. So perhaps the best description isn't Starfleet built the Akira to kill the Borg, it is Starfleet built the Akira for a galaxy where Borg attacks had become a realistic possibility. Which sounds boring, let's just call it the anti-Borg ship. Of course, when the Borg did return, Starfleet immediately put it on the front line. Let's talk about the Akira's first on-screen appearance. This was perhaps the most appropriate way possible, firing everything it had at a Borg cube. The Battle of Sector 001 kicked off in 2373, and unlike Wolf 359, this Starfleet battle group included a new generation of ships which had emerged after Starfleet's first devastating encounters with the Collective. Among them were multiple Akira-class vessels, including the most famous ship of the class, this being the USS Thunderchild, NCC 63549. The Thunderchild's name itself came from the H.G. Wells novel The War of the Worlds. In that story, as some of you might remember, HMS Thunderchild sacrificed itself engaging Martian war machines so civilians can escape. This is a pretty appropriate name for a ship that first appears throwing itself into battle against the Borg. At least 2 Akira-class vessels were reportedly destroyed during the Battle of Sector 001, but others survived the engagement. And visually, this is where the Akira's reputation really begins. It isn't introduced during a quiet survey mission. Its debut is amid explosions, torpedo fire, and debris, fighting one of the most dangerous enemies Starfleet and the Federation has ever encountered. And then Captain Picard arrives aboard the newly flashy Enterprise E. Using his residual connection to the Collective, Picard identifies what appears to be a vulnerable section of the Borg cube. The fleet concentrates its fire, and the cube is eventually destroyed. The Battle of Sector 001 becomes a rare example of Starfleet successfully stopping a Borg assault before Earth itself is assimilated. For the Akira class though, it wasn't a one-off appearance, because very soon, Starfleet was going to need every heavily armed ship it could get. Only a short time after this Borg attack, the Federation found itself facing a completely different kind of threat, the Dominion. And unlike the Borg, the Dominion wasn't sending one enormous vessel into Federation territory. This was a conventional interstellar war. This was fought with fleets over territory, destroying supply lines, crushing shipyards, and subjugating colonies. Hundreds of starships fighting across multiple battlefronts. And this is where the Akira class went from being a cool new ship introduced in First Contact to becoming a regular part of Starfleet's battle line. Akira class ships appeared repeatedly through the later seasons of Deep Space Nine. They fought in major fleet engagements and became one of the visual signatures of wartime Starfleet. In 2374, Akiras were part of a massive Starfleet force assembled for Operation Return. More than 600 Federation ships were committed in the attempt to retake Deep Space Nine and prevent Dominion reinforcements from entering the Alpha Quadrant. And that is exactly the kind of battle where a ship like the Akira makes sense. You need a large fleet formation, but you need ships with heavy torpedo armaments, strong phaser coverage, and the ability to launch auxiliary craft. Let's also not forget the Akira did have a relatively compact combat profile. This wasn't a Starfleet vessel that had to improvise into becoming a warship. I'm looking at you, Galaxy class. It already looked like one. The Akira would continue fighting throughout the Dominion War conflict. Ships of the class took part in the battles around Chintoka, including a Federation Klingon-Romulan campaign against Dominion positions. And these engagements demonstrated just how dangerous the war had become. At least 2 Akira-class ships were destroyed during the first Battle of Chintoka by the Cardassian orbital weapons platforms. That is worth mentioning because sometimes the Akira's reputation gets inflated into the almost invincible Starfleet supercruiser. Sure, these were powerful ships, but the Dominion War destroyed powerful starships on a constant basis. Even Galaxy-class starships were lost. The entire Federation fleet and the Allied fleet suffered catastrophic casualties. The Akira was built for combat, but that fact alone didn't make it safe. Akira-class vessels remained active through the later stages of the Dominion War, and were present in huge Starfleet formations which pushed deeper into Dominion-held territory. As we see in Deep Space Nine, the Akira is present for major operations including Operation Return, Chintoka, and the final battle surrounding Cardassia. And by this point, something important had happened. The Akira was no longer just one of those new background designs introduced for Star Trek First Contact. It had become part of Starfleet. Audiences recognised it and the effects teams reused it, and whenever Deep Space Nine needed to show us that Starfleet had assembled a serious fleet, there was usually an Akira somewhere in that formation. And when the Dominion War ended, this is where the Akira could easily have disappeared. After all, plenty of Star Trek ships exist mainly to fill the background of one particular era. The Akira didn't. It did survive the war and well into the next generation. Years later, when Voyager finally came home, Akira-class ships were standing guard over Earth. The Dominion War ended in 2375, but the Akira-class didn't. And that is important, because if the Akira had just been little more than an emergency response to the increased militarized 2370s, then this would have been an obvious point for the class to kind of fade into the background. Instead, Akiras continued serving throughout Starfleet. Of course the war was over, but the ship still had a job to do. Only a few years later, Akira-class vessels were once again operating around Earth for one of the most important homecomings in Starfleet history. This being the USS Voyager's return from the Delta Quadrant in 2378. After 7 years stranded tens of thousands of light years from Federation space, Captain Janeway and her crew found a Borg transwarp hub capable of providing a route home. Naturally, because this is Voyager, they didn't simply just use it, they also decided to destroy it. Voyager emerged from a transwarp aperture inside a Borg sphere, practically on Earth's doorstep, and Starfleet was waiting. A Federation fleet moved to intercept the Borg vessel, and among the ships present, along with the likes of the Galaxy-class and the Prometheus, were Akira-class starships. Once again, we find the Akira facing the Borg, except this time, the engagement doesn't last particularly long. Voyager destroys the sphere from within and emerges from the wreckage. After 7 years, the crew is finally home. For us, though, the important detail is what Starfleet had stationed around Earth. The Akira was still there. The class had survived the Dominion War and remained part of the fleet during the Federation's return to peacetime. And as the 2380s began, it did continue to appear. Akira-class ships remained active during the animated series era of Star Trek Lower Decks. By now, we're more than a decade removed from the class's first appearance during a battle of Sector 001. And the ship has settled into the kind of role we'd expect from a successful Starfleet design. It is no longer treated as something unusual, it's simply part of a fleet. Which, in a strange way, is one of the best things that can happen to any Starship class. Starfleet does not need the Akira to be famous, it needs hundreds of vessels capable of doing their jobs. And despite the Akira's reputation as a heavily armed combat vessel, its carrier configuration gives it plenty to do when the Federation isn't fighting an interstellar war. As we mentioned earlier, this can range from patrol missions, to disaster relief, to even deployment of shuttlecraft. Naturally, the weapons might be what made the Akira famous, but they weren't necessarily the only reason to keep the class around. And eventually, the Akira would survive into another generation entirely. By the 2380s, Akira-class vessels were still operating as part of Starfleet's active forces. And during the events surrounding the USS Protostar, several would become caught up in one of the strangest fleet disasters Starfleet had ever experienced. The Protostar, en route to the Federation, carried a weapon known as the Living Construct. And unlike a conventional weapon, the construct wasn't simply designed to blow up a starship. It was designed to turn Starfleet's own technology against itself. Once activated, it spread through connected Federation systems and caused Starfleet vessels to identify one another as hostile. You know, when I hear that and just read it out loud, I do wonder why Starfleet then, 20 years later in Star Trek Picard, decided to do a fleet synchronization system or coordination system. Yeah, anyway. Now the result was chaos. Starfleet starships began attacking each other. A fleet that would have been working together instead became a battlefield, and Akira-class vessels were among the ships caught in the disaster. Once again, we see the class operating alongside much newer designs. The Akira had now survived the Borg crisis of the 2370s, the Dominion War, the return of Voyager, and had successfully continued service into the following decade. Even that wasn't the end, because by the dawn of the 25th century, Akiras were still in service. We actually see one at the start of Season 2 of Picard, but that's only for a small cameo. We see plenty more Akiras in 2401. By this time, Starfleet assembled an enormous collection of its own ships around Earth for Frontier Day. The celebration marked the anniversary of the launch of the NX-01 Enterprise and brought together ships from across the fleet. And if you look amongst that enormous formation, the Akira-class is still there, more than 25 years after we first saw the design fighting the Borg in First Contact. Of course, Frontier Day went slightly wrong, because apparently Starfleet should stop organising large celebrations involving its entire fleet. I mean, seriously guys, come on. The Borg and Changelings exploit Starfleet's new fleet formation technology, linking vessels together and allowing them to be controlled as a single system. Young Starfleet personnel were assimilated through altered transporter technology. The fleet turned on itself, and Earth came under attack, thankfully not before the starbase was able to protect it. Once again, Akira-class ships found themselves involved in a Borg crisis. And there's certainly some symmetry to that. Our first major look at the Akira was defending the Earth from Borg. More than 25 years later, it's still defending Earth from the Borg, although admittedly, things become considerably more complicated the second time around. All of this I've mentioned gives the Akira a surprisingly impressive service history. Its basic design remains recognisable from 2373 into 2401. That's nearly 3 decades of confirmed service appearances, and potentially longer depending on exactly when the ships first entered service. This doesn't quite reach the Excelsior levels of refusing to retire, give it another 70 years basically, but it does demonstrate that Starfleet hadn't created a disposable wartime vessel. The Akira survived the conflict it became famous for. It remained useful afterwards, and has served alongside multiple generations of Federation Starship design. Which does raise another question. We keep talking about the Akira class, but what about the individual starships? Because while the class never received its own television series, Star Trek has given us several named Akiras, and one of them has become synonymous with the entire design. Of course, the most famous Akira-class starship is undoubtedly the USS Thunderchild, registry NCC 63549. As we mentioned earlier, its name is a reference to the H.G. Wells novel The War of the Worlds. The fictional HMS Thunderchild fights on Martian war machines while civilian vessels escape. So when designer Alex Yeager needed a name for the ship defending Earth from a Borg, Thunderchild was an extremely appropriate choice. Now this ship did survive the Battle of Sector 001, and over the years, the Thunderchild became the Akira most frequently associated with the class in reference material and merchandise, but it wasn't alone. Another vessel, named the USS Rabin, NCC 63293, this name honoured physicist Michael Oscar Rabin, while the registry reportedly referenced the birthday of Yeager's father. And this is something we'll see repeatedly with the ship's creator for First Contact, because these vessels had very little screen time and almost no dialogue identifying them individually. The production team could hide personal references inside name and registries. The Rabin was another Akira associated with the Battle of Sector 001. Unlike the Thunderchild, the name helped turn what might otherwise have been an anonymous background model into an identifiable Starfleet vessel. We then had the USS Spectre, NCC 65549. Again, this is another Akira-class vessel associated with Starfleet service during this era. And beyond these better known ships, the class continued appearing under additional names and registries throughout later productions and reference material. But I'm deliberately not going to spend the next 5 minutes reading out every registry number we can find, because ultimately, the most important Akira isn't one particular ship, it is the design itself. Unlike the Enterprise, Voyager or Defiant, there isn't one heroic Akira whose adventures define the class. Instead, we know the Akira throughout the fleet. We see them charging into battle, flying alongside other Starfleet ships, defending Earth, fighting the Dominion, and appearing decades later alongside vessels that didn't even exist when the Akira was first designed. This is rather appropriate, because the Akira itself was created specifically to solve a problem within Starfleet's own fleet. Not an in-universe problem, but a real-world one. When the production team began work on Star Trek First Contact, they realised something important. Yes, the Borg were about to attack Earth, and Starfleet did need ships to fight them. But the producers didn't want the fleet to consist entirely of the same handful of Starship models we've been looking at for years, basically Wolf 359 Mark II. They needed something new, and one young designer was about to create 4 of the most recognisable Starfleet ships of the entire era, including the Akira-class. When production began on Star Trek First Contact, the filmmakers knew the opening battle needed scale. This wasn't going to be another confrontation involving 2 or 3 ships. The Borg were attacking Earth. Starfleet would respond with a fleet. But there was a problem. The existing Starfleet ships available to the visual effects team were largely designs audiences already knew. Yes, the Galaxy-class, Miranda-class, Excelsior-class, and of course the Oberth-class, even though it's slightly useless. These ships had populated Star Trek for years now, and a first contact was going to represent a newer, more battle-ready Starfleet. The fleet needed to look newer as well. Enter designer Alex Yeager. Yeager was already working Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, and remarkably, he was only 22 years old when he was given the task of helping develop a new generation of Starfleet vessels for the film. His assignment was initially much bigger than the 4 ships we eventually received. Yeager began by producing roughly 18 different concepts. The idea was to give Starfleet's fleet much greater visual variety, different sizes, different silhouettes, and basically different apparent roles. Essentially, make the Federation fleet feel more like an actual fleet rather than 12 copies of whatever models happened to be available. But there was a practical problem: money. Every new vessel had to be modelled. This included being textured, lit, animated, rendered. And although CGI was making it possible to create ships without enormous physical miniatures, 18 brand new detailed starships was still a lot, so the number was reduced. Eventually, 4 major new Federation designs emerged: the Sabre-class, Steamrunner-class, Norway-class, and of course the Akira-class. But what inspired the Akira? Yeager approached the Akira with a much more militaristic mindset than we normally associate with Federation starship design. Remember the context. The ship was created to appear in a battle against the Borg. It needed to look like it belonged there. And one of Yeager's inspirations came from a very different part of the Star Trek universe: the Klingon bird of prey. Not because the Akira looks exactly like a Klingon vessel, it clearly doesn't, but Yeager liked the bird of prey's aggressive posture, the way the ship appears to lean forward towards its target. The sense of the vessel is almost physically attacking whatever is in front of it. He wanted some of that attitude in the Akira-class. And then there was another famous influence: the Miranda-class USS Reliant, specifically its weapons roll bar. The Miranda-class had demonstrated that you could take the familiar Starfleet saucer and nacelle language and rearrange it into something that looked considerably more tactical. The Akira's weapon pod follows a similar idea, except Yeager took it much further. Instead of simply mounting a couple of torpedo launchers above the ship, he filled the thing with them. This is where that famous 17 launcher concept originates. Yeager later explained that because the ship's job in First Contact was essentially to fight the Borg, he wasn't particularly concerned about designing laboratories, botanical gardens, or enormous diplomatic facilities. He was thinking just about weapons. That wasn't the only unusual idea he incorporated, because as we mentioned before, the Akira isn't merely a gunship. Yeager also imagined it as a carrier. The forward shuttle bay doors and protected rear recovery area weren't accidental details added by somebody modelling the ship later. They were fundamental to Yeager's original concept. He imagined auxiliary craft launching through the front of a vessel and then returning through the rear. Yes, I am thinking of Battlestar Galactica. That arrangement meant damaged or vulnerable craft wouldn't necessarily need to approach directly through the same area that other ships were launching. Instead, they could recover behind the protection of the Akira's hull. So from the beginning, Yeager was effectively combining several different ideas, this being a Starfleet cruiser, a torpedo-heavy gunship, and an aircraft carrier, all wrapped inside something that still had to look unmistakably Federation. And somehow, it worked. The final design still has a recognisable saucer and twin nacelles, but almost everything else is unconventional. No traditionally secondary hull, there's also no neck, and the nacelles are underneath the ship. Twin structures stretching backwards from the saucer, a huge weapons pod on top, and a flight deck running through the vessel. With all of this, it is still recognisably a Starfleet ship. And there was another major difference between the Akira and many of the famous Starfleet vessels which came before it. There was no physical studio model. The Akira was born digitally. Unlike such Starfleet ships as the original Enterprise, Enterprise D, or even the Excelsior class, the Akira was created as a CGI model for First Contact. Unfortunately, no giant physical Akira miniature was constructed for filming, and that was part of a much larger change happening within Star Trek production during the 1990s. Computer-generated ships were becoming increasingly practical. They could be duplicated, repositioned, modified, and placed into enormous fleet sequences which would have been vastly more difficult using traditional motion control photography alone. That became particularly useful when Deep Space Nine entered the Dominion War, because suddenly the production team needed battles involving hundreds of starships, and the Akira was ready. The digital model could be reused and later rebuilt or improved for subsequent television appearances, which helped turn the ship originally created for a few moments in First Contact in one of the most defining background vessels of the late 24th century. But the strangest part of the Akira's design is still to come, because a few years later, Star Trek needed to design another new hero ship, an Enterprise. Because this one wouldn't exist after Picard, it would exist before Kirk. So when the designers started developing the NX-01 Enterprise, they looked back at the Akira, which means one of Starfleet's most futuristic combat-oriented ships helped inspire one of its earliest explorers, and once you put them side by side, it's very difficult to unsee this. When Star Trek Enterprise entered development, the production team faced a difficult design problem. They needed to create a new USS Enterprise, but unlike every previous television series, this one had to look older. The NX-01 existed more than a century before Kirk's Enterprise. This is before the Federation, before Starfleet had developed many of the technologies we'd come to take for granted. So the ship needed to feel recognisably connected to Star Trek while also looking like something from an earlier and more primitive era. And one of the designs that influenced that solution was the Akira-class. Once you put these two ships together, the resemblance is pretty obvious. Both are dominated by a large saucer section. Both have structures extending backwards from the saucer. Neither uses the traditional Starfleet arrangement of a saucer connected through a neck to a large secondary engineering hull. The overall silhouettes are remarkably similar. Now this did lead to the NX-01 occasionally being jokingly described by fans as the Akira prize, and to be fair, you can see why. The resemblance was not accidental. Production material surrounding the Akira specifically notes the ship became an influence on the NX-01 Enterprise several years later. But the challenge wasn't simply to copy the Akira and make it look older. The NX-01 still needed its own identity, so the basic configuration could provide inspiration, while the details communicated a completely different era. NX-01 is flatter, more industrial, its hull plating is much more prominent. The nacelles evoke the technology which would eventually develop into the familiar Starfleet warp engines of later centuries. And the ship lacks the enormous weapons pod which dominates the Akira's upper profile. That makes sense. The Akira was designed with combat very much in mind, whereas the NX-01 is supposed to represent humanity taking its first major steps into deep space. Same broad design language, completely different purpose, and there's something wonderfully backwards about that. In universe, the NX-01 predates the Akira by more than 2 centuries. So from our perspective inside Star Trek, you can almost look at the Akira and imagine Starfleet rediscovering elements of its earliest design heritage. But behind the scenes, the opposite happened. A ship from the 24th century helped inspire the Enterprise of the 22nd century. That's probably the greatest testament to how successful Alex Yeager's design was. The Akira was created as one of several new background ships for a battle sequence. It wasn't the Enterprise, it was never going to be the hero ship. It wasn't even supposed to be the centre of attention. Yet the design was strong enough that a few years later, when Star Trek needed its new television Enterprise, people were still looking at the Akira. That's quite a legacy for a ship that originally existed to spend a few seconds firing torpedoes at a Borg cube. And it does bring us back to the question we've been asking throughout this video, because the Akira's appearance in First Contact shaped the way Star Trek fans have viewed that ship ever since. The reputation does seem obvious, but was the Akira-class actually Starfleet's anti-Borg starship? If we judge the Akira purely by what it looks like, you'd probably say yes. This thing is built for a fight. The design deliberately reduces the traditional vertical profile of a Federation starship, and the bridge sits within a more protected area of the hull. Even its shuttle facilities allow for it to deploy and recover numerous auxiliary craft. And then there's that weapons pod, phasers, photon torpedoes, quantum torpedoes in technical descriptions, and according to the designer's original concept, as many as 17 torpedo launchers. Yeah, that's a lot. Then look at the ship's service history. Its first appearance was fighting the Borg, then it becomes a regular feature at Starfleet's Dominion War battle groups. Later Akiras are present when a Borg sphere arrives near Earth with Voyager, and decades later, ships of the class are still around during events leading into Frontier Day. So it's easy to understand how the Akira gained its reputation, but there is an important distinction. Unlike the Defiant class, Star Trek canon never explicitly tells us on screen that the Akira program was created specifically to fight the Borg. That's the part we need to be careful with. The Defiant absolutely has that history. Commander Sisko tells us that Starfleet began developing it as a response to the Borg threat. With the Akira, we don't get the equivalent scene. Nobody turns around and says, yeah, we got our ass kicked at Wolf 359 and decided to build this ship. The Eaglemoss material we've been using gives us a broader picture. It places the Akira's development in an era when Starfleet's strategic environment was becoming increasingly dangerous. This included the conflict with the Cardassians, the Cardassian border war, and the arrival of a Borg threat. That distinction actually makes the ship more interesting, because the Akira represents something bigger than one enemy. The Starfleet of the 24th century had enjoyed a relatively stable period. Exploration remained at the heart of the organisation, and ships like the Galaxy-class embodied that confidence. Then things started changing. The Cardassian border conflict kicked off, the Borg became a bigger threat, then the Dominion. Suddenly, Starfleet needed vessels capable of operating in a much more dangerous galaxy, and the Akira fits perfectly into that transition. It's still recognisably a Federation starship, it's still capable of missions beyond combat. Its enormous auxiliary craft facilities would be extremely useful for rescue, evacuation, patrol, and exploration. And that weapons pod, and I know we keep mentioning it, could even accommodate specialised sensor equipment according to that technical manual. But of course, we then look at the ship when diplomacy fails. The Akira doesn't need another ship to protect it. It can fight, and it can do a lot of damage. It's not necessarily an anti-Borg ship from the get-go, and it's not quite a dedicated warship like the Defiant, but it is a combat-orientated heavy cruiser and carrier built for an era in which Starfleet could no longer assume every mission would remain peaceful. And unfortunately for the Federation, Starfleet engineers were absolutely right to build it, because within only a few years, the Akira would go from fighting the Borg at Earth to fighting the Dominion across the Alpha Quadrant. A ship designed during a period of growing uncertainty suddenly found itself serving one of the largest wars in Federation history, and it survived. There's another reason I think the Akira deserves more attention. It achieved all of this without ever becoming a hero ship. There was no USS Thunderchild television series, no captain spending 7 seasons commanding an Akira, no Akira-class vessel carrying the name Enterprise. It was kinda just in the background most of the time. And yet nearly 30 years after Starship First Contact introduced the design, we're still talking about it. That's because the Akira managed to communicate what it was without needing hours of exposition. You see the weapons pod, the broad saucer, the enormous shuttle bays, and the catamaran hull, and you understand that this is a different kind of Starfleet ship. Alex Yeager was only tasked with creating something new for the Battle of Sector 001. Instead, he created one of the most recognisable Starfleet vessels of the late 24th century, one that would appear through the Dominion War, survive into the 2380s, and remain active well into the 25th century. It also even influenced the design of the NX-01 Enterprise. That's a remarkable legacy for what was originally just a background ship. So, the big question, is the Akira-class really Star Trek's anti-Borg ship? I'd say so, sort of. It's certainly represented, but Starfleet had emerged after encounters with threats like the Borg had changed the Federation's understanding of what it might face out in the final frontier. And from a production perspective, Alex Yeager absolutely designed the Akira with combat in mind. But reducing the ship to simply the anti-Borg one undersells what actually makes it interesting. The Akira is many things: a carrier, a cruiser, a patrol ship, a rescue platform, and when required, a heavily armed combat vessel capable of unleashing an enormous amount of firepower. It fought the Borg, it fought the Dominion, and decades later, Starfleet was still operating the class. For a vessel, which started out life as one of the several new background ships created for Star Trek First Contact, the Akira-class certainly made an impression. And personally, I think it's one of the best Starfleet designs we've ever had. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think of the Akira-class? Would you have liked to see one of them become a hero ship in its own Star Trek series? Actually, there's some books it is featured in. Also, what role do you think actually suits the Akira best? Let me know in the comments below, because if you're talking about Star Trek, then we want to hear about it. And if you've enjoyed this Starship breakdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more Star Trek Starship breakdowns, lore videos, deep dives, and more coming your way here on Trek Central. You can also follow us across social media for the latest Star Trek news and updates. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.